All right, everyone. I would like to welcome everyone, all of our participants today to this webinar on walking the talk and how funders can apply the principles of systems change to our work. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I just want to start by saying a few things about Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Our mission is to accelerate philanthropy in pursuit of a just world. We're a global nonprofit working toward philanthropic growth and innovation with a diverse team of experienced grant makers with a depth of knowledge across the spectrum of issue areas. We were founded in 2002 and are one of the world's largest philanthropic service organizations. Our partnerships with Alliance Magazine and with many of you on this webinar today represent how we aim to achieve our vision by uniting people, ideas, partnerships, and resources in bigger, bolder, and more innovative ways. One of our efforts, the Shifting Systems Initiative launched in 2016, focuses on these objectives. I want to just say that as you're listening to our participants, please note in the bottom right-hand side of your screen should be a chat function. You can put your questions or comments in there. We have a very tight agenda today, but we hope to get to at least a few questions during this webinar. The speakers, the topics and themes today reflect that vision and mission that I just spoke about. We're going to tackle questions that often arise in philanthropy, and that's what this webinar is shaped around. How do funders effectively design for and measure results that may take a decade or more to see? What are the entry points for funders in the complex and dynamic field of information ecosystems? And why is effective collaboration an essential component of transformative philanthropy in this space? I want to mention that the bios of all of the speakers are available online, and I encourage you to be in touch with us and with them in the days and weeks to come. I want to now introduce our first speaker, Latanya Mapp, the President and CEO of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. Latanya, over to you.
Thanks so much, Heather. It's really great to be here with all of you, and I thank Alliance and all of the speakers for the discussion that we're about to have today. I mean, the topic really is to illuminate the importance of deep collaboration to solve the urgent problems facing our world. And as RPA has found in our work on systems change over the last 8 years, the systems we have in the world are not broken. Rather, these systems work for those who have the power and influence to control them. I mean, I've worked in development and philanthropy for more than 30 years now, and I've seen systems changed over that time, most for the better, but some for the worse. I was at Beijing Conference on Women in 1995, and then I was part of celebrating its 25th generation equality work that happened in Mexico and Paris, and realizing that maybe we've been changing systems, but not changing them fast enough. I lived in South Africa when apartheid ended, and in Egypt during the Arab Spring. And in both cases, just seeing how important it was to be able to watch and to be a part of the systems change that was happening. And I've really been watching in fascination as systems continue to change even faster. And we have to work together with collective action if we are to ensure that those most deeply impacted by these systems are also the architects of the system and the systemic change that is required. So I'm super excited to hear from Renata, who will highlight the work of her Brazilian organization, Arapyaú, and how they're addressing the challenges of an extractive economic system that has placed short-term profits above protecting people and nature. And of course, hearing from our colleagues Jess Flutie from the Skoll Foundation and Imran from the Center for Countering Digital Hate, who both illustrate how grantee partners and funders can work together to challenge today's global information ecosystem that is built on a market system that privileges profit over the well-being of the people who use these everyday structures. So each of these three organizations are field builders, strengthening networks and catalyzing solutions that would be impossible if they didn't have collaboration at the heart of their work. And so our mission, as Heather said, at RPA is to accelerate this kind of philanthropy in pursuit of a just world. And we already work with many of you in this webinar to build and exchange knowledge across different fields of work and to catalyze support for amazing organizations like the ones we're talking about today across the world, and our vision to partner with all of you for a future where resources are obligated and equitably accessible to communities that are driving this kind of transformational social change worldwide means that our priorities in the coming months and years are to galvanize better leadership across the sectors, whether that's philanthropy, business, or government, and to push philanthropy to be faster, bigger, better, and bolder in all the things that we do. I think our speakers today are great models for how that can happen, and I hope we find this webinar thought-provoking and that all of you will share with RPA your ideas and your efforts, both during this call, but also afterwards. And with that, I look forward to the conversation and hand it back over to Heather. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Latanya. I'm glancing a bit at the chat, and I see someone has asked if this is being recorded. Yes, it's being recorded, so anyone who wants can access it afterwards. All right, I now want to turn to Renata Piazzon. She is the Executive Director of Arapyaú, a Brazilian funding organization that I've known about for many years. That's just tremendous. And so we're very happy to have you with us today, Renata. I want to start with a question. I think your foundation is a great example of an organization that makes long-term commitments to structural initiatives to create systemic change. I'm sure not all of our participants are familiar with it. Can you tell us about the origin of Arapyaú, your work in the South American Atlantic forest biome, and how you work with both networks and coalitions to ensure that nature, people, and economy are in balance? Thanks.
Thank you so much, Heather and RPA and Alliance. It's really an honor to be here. I'm speaking today from a city that has the worst air quality in the world right now, São Paulo, because of climate change, severe drought, and fires in the whole country, especially in the Amazon region. So I just really want to emphasize that today we have nothing to celebrate here. But I'm really happy to join this webinar because I do think that we are failing on climate because we're not thinking systemically. So I really appreciate the title of this webinar. And Arapyaú is a Brazilian philanthropy that exists for 15 years now to promote a fair, inclusive, and low carbon development of Brazil. And through this 15-year history, we have learned that to talk about climate, we cannot talk about climate. So we really need to talk about development. We need to talk about prosperity. So that's why in our vision, it's a low carbon development of the country. And I was in Manaus last week in the Amazon region, and I heard from one of the biggest business leader in the region, Renata, you know what? Like we don't really care about forests here. Like we live in Manaus, but we do want a better life, and we want to create the conditions for the investments for the standing forest to generate income for those that live in the forest. So it seems obvious, but not all the time our approach to climate involves all of that. So we really want to create other examples of business rather than cattle, for example, with all the cowboy culture in the Amazon region that is really successful. And without this economic guarantee, we won't achieve climate security, food security, energy transition, and everything that we want on net zero to 2050. So that's why we have been known as incubators of networks and initiatives that promote systemic change. So we have this premise of medium to long-term horizon investments with local engagement and putting the people at the center of the discussion. So we're not talking more about nature-based solutions. We're advocating for nature and people-based solutions. So we truly believe that that nothing can be achieved in isolation. So collaboration is key. And I think you emphasized that in the beginning. And for that, we need to mobilize and coordinate diverse actors, including civil society, philanthropy, academia, public and private sector. So we're really convinced that we need to put everyone in the table. We need to give up on reaching consensus, and we need to find convergence. So that's a big difference. Like, we don't necessarily need to agree with 100% of what everyone in the table said, but I allow it to continue. So that's what we're seeking for when we put together civil society, philanthropy, academia, and public and private sector. And with that principle, we have incubated many networks in Brazil. The first one was Mapiomas, which is today one of the biggest projects in monitoring and detecting deforestation in the country. Then the Brazilian Coalition, then the Amazon Consultation, and most recently, the Forest People Connection. And these are all networks, but I really want to emphasize the last one, the Forest People Connection, because I think this is one of the best examples of the way we approach climate with a systemic lens. So this network began after a meeting we have with representatives from indigenous communities, Quilombola communities, which are the descendants of enslaved Africans, and riverside communities. We call it ribeirinhos in Brazil. And we asked them, what is the number one need for you to protect your territory? And the answer of them was connectivity. So for us, climate funders, that was completely unusual, but for them, connectivity was essential to stay in their territory, to anticipate invasions, to have access to health through telemedicine, to have access to education through distance learning, entrepreneurship, financial services. So there's a lot on digital literacy. So we decided to support and to incubate as a climate philanthropy, this network. And we are already in 1,000 communities, and the goal is to reach 5,000 communities by the end of 2025, impacting 1 million people. I think this project is really an example of one assumption that we really hold dearly, that is participation and local representation, because this has been led by 3 grassroots organizations, CONAC, COIAB, and CNS, so the 3 of them representing indigenous, quilombolas, and riverside communities. And it has really opened the possibility for us to look to the Amazon region with a systemic lens. So as a final message for now, I really want to emphasize that for us, it's really essential as climate funders for us to start incorporating the value of natural capital, like forests, ocean, and other ecosystems, into our understanding of wealth and well-being. And for that, we need to change our narrative. Like, if the value of the forest were included in the GDP calculations, Brazil would be one of the world's leading economies. So this is a challenge for us as philanthropy, but I think for us, with intelligence, with resources, and with the capacity that we have to innovate, we can address that to promote the transformation that we need. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renata. And I think you're demonstrating that embracing complexity is not something that funders should be afraid of, but something that really brings greater impact. And yeah, you've mentioned that in so many ways. Let me ask you just a second question. Since you're in Brazil, we know that many organizations, I'm sure many on this webinar today, will be descending on Brazil late next year for Climate COP30. What will you be sharing with participants, with those who reach out to you, who are coming, as the most significant challenges in working in the Amazon and other areas that funders have to be aware of? And how have you addressed them in your organization?
Thank you. Yeah, all eyes are in Brazil right now because of G20 and then COP30 and then BRICS Plus. And we have also elections in the middle, so it's been quite intense right now. But first, I think COP30 holds great importance also because of the choice of Belém, the capital of Pará, as the city to host COP30. I think that's deeply symbolic because it's located in the heart of the Amazon. And the Amazon will for sure draw global attention as a region that embodies a lot of complexity. So I think you asked about the challenges in working in the Amazon. I think the first one as a climate philanthropy is the recognition of the Amazon's diversity. So there's no one single Amazon. To simplify, we have been at least calling 4 different regions. So there's the urban area where 70% of the population of the Amazon lives. There's the area of the intact forest, the conserved areas. Then there is the arch of deforestation, the area that is under threat, severe threat. And then the area that was already converted, the converted areas. So for each of those areas, we have to promote different bioeconomies or forest economy development models. So for the areas already converted, and I know it's super polemic, but we have been calling, there's an opportunity for agro-bioeconomy, like bioeconomy of commodities for the area already converted. For the conserved areas, there's a lot of opportunities on the social bioeconomy, like promoting new products on the standing forest for cosmetic companies and different services, and a lot on research and development. And for the arch of deforestation, there's a lot on the promotion of restoration, for example. So we need to embrace diversity and not simplify what is immensely complex in the Amazon region. I think the second thing that I already said, it's the need for an integrated agenda. So we really need to understand that to address deforestation, we need to promote development. So the end of deforestation will be a consequence of a better wealth and well-being of those people living in the forest, living in the Amazon region. We have almost 30 million people living there. So we need an ambition of development for the Amazon region that integrates what people needs. And that's not very much different from what we need here in São Paulo as I'm speaking. And I think the third one that is really a challenge, but really crucial, is for us to understand that we need combination of different capitals to scale our impact. So we need to combine philanthropic capital with private investment. That's really key. We have some examples at Arapyaú that we have been done of blended finance mechanisms, especially with the Brazilian National Development Bank, BNDES, which has been doing a great work on this area, providing credit with technical assistance for small-scale producers in Atlantic Forest and in the Amazon region. And that really needs to be escalated. So we're really convinced that we need to mobilize resources from the private sector through innovative mechanisms to finance a nature and people-based solutions economy, and also to mobilize public capital. So philanthropy can play a critical role in fostering that and in promoting this high integrity business that we could have as alternative on illegality and deforestation practices that we see now still happening in the Amazon region. So just to end, I think we really need to understand climate with the lens of development, embracing social, environmental, and economic development. We need to create the conditions for business to thrive, and we need to innovate with different combinations of capital. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you so much, Renata. I think that was a lot of great pointers for all of us that are going to be engaging in COP30 and other events and processes in Brazil in the coming years. We are now turning to the second broad theme of this webinar, and some of you might be wondering, why did we combine climate philanthropy and information ecosystems? The answer is because our Shifting Systems initiative that RPA has been working on since 2016, we decided early this year to go deeper into a few different areas of work. And one of them is climate philanthropy, because so much resources are going into this area. But the second is the question of narratives, how narratives shape our world. I was at an Artivism conference last week in South Africa, and Fabiana Rodriguez made the point, culture changes people and people change systems. And how do people think about the world around them, and how do we or others influence how people are thinking? The whole question of information ecosystems is quite central to that. So it's related to climate and environment, but distinctive as well. Our next speaker is Jess Flutie, a principal at the Skoll Foundation based in California. Skoll was a launching funder of our initiative and has been a great partner over the years. Jess, thanks for joining us today. Can you tell us why and how the Skoll Foundation has created a portfolio of work that you call information integrity? What does that mean, and what kind of work do you fund?
Heather, and it's great to be here with all of you. And Renata, our climate approach is so similar to yours, it sounds like. So excited to learn more about that as well. So the Skoll Foundation is a 25-year-old philanthropy. We're based in Palo Alto, and we were founded by Jeff Skoll, who was the founding president of eBay. And throughout our history, we have funded social entrepreneurs and social innovators across a wide number of issue areas, including democracy, climate, global health, and justice and equity. And a few years ago, we really started to see a really common challenge emerging across all of those areas. We were hearing directly from our portfolio of grantees across the gamut that mis and disinformation were really becoming a barrier to these grantees' ability to advance their work. And we also, fundamentally believe that a healthy democracy requires healthy information ecosystems and sources of high quality information so that citizens can come together and solve these big collective challenges, whether that is climate policy or an appropriate public health response to a pandemic. And so we started some just exploratory grant making in this space in 2020 and 2021 through our strategy office. And then ultimately decided just last year at the beginning of 2023 to really start building a dedicated portfolio centered on advancing information integrity globally. So in terms of what we fund under this program, as I said, social innovation has always been at the core of what the Skoll Foundation funds, and we look for innovators who are changing the broader system in which they work. They're not just addressing the symptoms of a problem, but they're really looking at the root causes and how to shift those systems permanently. And so in the information integrity portfolio, there's sort of three areas that we support. One is helping civil society and citizens to navigate and reject mis and disinformation. The second is improving access to accurate, trusted, culturally relevant information sources for citizens. And then the third is looking at organizations who are looking at the incentive structures that have led technology platforms to prioritize engaging content, engaging content over accurate and trustworthy information. And often, as we know, engaging content tends to be more often false or harmful or polarizing. And because that grabs our attention, that leads to more advertisement and revenue. And so we now have this system where the incentives are actually mismatched with the public good and sort of democracy writ large. And so those are the three spaces in which we fund under information integrity. And we have taken an intentionally cross-cutting approach with those other priorities that I mentioned earlier: democracy, climate, public health, et cetera. So we really prioritize grantees who work at the intersection of those places where information challenges are affecting our climate response or a healthy democracy here in the US. So that has led us to Imran and his team at the Center for Countering Digital Hate. They are really taking a systems approach to tackling this problem, really starting with online hate, but also looking at the real world impacts of disinformation across a number of different issues, including elections and child safety. And so we were thrilled to partner with Imran and his team starting last year. And excited to have him and his 2-week-old daughter here with us today.
Thank you, Jess. And I just want to say before we hear from Imran, if you have questions, if you're starting to formulate questions for any of our speakers, please go ahead and put it into the Slido where the questions go. Yes, so Imran Ahmed, who some of us learned about and heard from for the first time at the Skoll World Forum earlier this year, but a number of funders have been supporting you, Imran, over the years. You are the executive director of the Center for Countering Digital Hate. And when we had a planning call earlier, as Jess mentioned some days ago, Imran's 5-day-old daughter was on the call, and she may make a cameo appearance today. We hope so. But Imran, your organization tackles a problem that many funders, I think, care about, but have real difficulty defining and understanding what are the entry points. So tell us about the themes that you work on and the scale of the crisis that you're tackling. Over to you.
Sure. Hi, my name is Imran Ahmed. I'm CEO and founder of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. We're as of next Monday, we're a 5-year-old organization, initially set up in London in the wake of the Brexit referendum and the assassination of my colleague, Jo Cox MP, to an organization now which has over 30 members of staff in 3 locations: Brussels, London, and Washington, DC, which is where I'm based in DC. But it really started with CCDH started in a moment of grief, in the moments after the Brexit referendum, a referendum that was marred by disinformation and hate narratives that eventually led a man to take the life of my colleague Jo, who was a 41-year-old mother of 2. She was shot, stabbed, and beaten to death on the streets of her constituency in Batley and Spen in the northwest of England, by a man who believed in a version of the Great Replacement theory, a theory that some of you will have heard about. It was the underlying ideology, the belief that led to the Christchurch massacre of Muslims, to the Pittsburgh Tree of Life synagogue massacre, and to much more violence and pain since. And in fact, it's still being used. You'll hear variations of it being used right now in the 2024 presidential election, being weaponized by the Republicans. I'm only smiling because I can hear that she's worked out this is the exact moment not to wake up, and she's waking up. So I may have to in a second. What we've realized over that time, what we realized fairly quickly, was that what we were dealing with was a crisis of disinformation. Disinformation and hate are inextricably interlinked. All hatreds rely on lies, all of them. It's most obvious when it comes to anti-Semitism, right? Because you've got the blood libel 2,000 years ago, you've got the protocols of the Elders of Zion that informed Hitler's ideology, and then you've got the Great Replacement theory in the 21st century. But hate and lies are always inextricably interlinked. You know, gays are groomers, like trans people are this, you know, etc., etc., etc. And we wanted to understand why lies were becoming, why the lies that underpin hate were becoming so prevalent. And ours was a systems analysis. So we have the time and space to look at these things systemically. And also we had the real advantage in the UK, and this was a gift that was given to us, that it was happening simultaneously on both the left and the right. There was a disinformation crisis being generated on both sides. Not just that, but we could look overseas in the June of 2016, when I really started the planning for CCDH, and we could see that it was happening in the US at the same time as well in that 2016 election. And so we realized it wasn't a result of one individual. It wasn't based on contingent circumstances. This is a systemic problem. And so it required systemic analysis, and it would require in time a systemic solution. And I think that was a gift that we were given, that if we hadn't been given that, we might have seen it as being the result of Donald Trump or of X or Y or Z. And what we settled on was that essentially what we were looking at was the inevitable negative externalities of a major economic shift. And here's why I find climate and disinformation so well aligned. In fact, you know, the guy who told me to set up CCDH, who urged me to do it, is the CEO of GSCC, which some of you will know, Tom Brooks, who's on my board as well, and is a close friend, because he said, look, you're dealing with a very similar problem. What we're seeing, Brexit was an extreme weather event. It was an iceberg melting. The rise of autocrats around the world, individually, those were another extreme weather event, but underpinning it is something more fundamental. And when it comes to the climate crisis, it's because of a really positive economic evolution, industrialization. Industrialization's negative externality was the production of CO2. The slow accrual of CO2 in our atmosphere eventually leads to climate change, right? It's the same thing with the digitization of our economy. It has unleashed enormous economic productivity, such a positive in so many ways. How we're communicating today, the way in which many of us receive succor, find information, maintain relationships, create relationships, the ways in which we set our social mores these days, our norms of attitude and behavior, we negotiate our values, we even negotiate the corpus of information that we call facts to shift it to these online spaces. They're vital to our day-to-day lives. And yet, slowly, bit by bit, we're accruing disinformation in our information ecosystem. And that's leading to destabilizing effects. And it's not just doing it when it comes to hate. The second I launched CCDH, Climate came along and said, hey, we have a real problem with climate-related disinformation, and it's evolving and changing. And we've got a really important report that I'd suggest you look on our website, counterhate.com is our website, called The New Climate Denial, that is an AI-powered study to look at the evolution of climate denial narratives over 5 years. It's an incredible piece of work. But, you know, we also have the sexual and reproductive rights movement come along and say, hey, we've got a real problem, so we're doing work with MSI in Africa on that. We launched in September 2019. In March 2020, there was a disinformation epidemic caused by the pandemic. And that disinformation pandemic was actually a parallel. It was dovetailing with the biological pandemic. And in fact, disinformation ended up taking a ton of lives too. Think of all those people who died gasping for breath in ICUs, begging doctors for a vaccine that wouldn't work and that they had once thought might harm them. And so what we've done is taken that systems level analysis and said, well, what are the economic incentives for the hyper production, the hyper distribution of disinformation over good information? And it is an asymmetric battlefield. And our analysis was that it's because these companies, as Jess explained, and there's a famous chart from Mark Zuckerberg where he shows on the x-axis is how violative, how close to breaking the rules content is, and on the y-axis is engagement. It's flat until you get to the point of being violative, and then it shoots up in an exponential curve. And that's because the closer you get to violating norms, the more likely it is people will engage. Engagement doesn't just mean people saying, I agree with you. It means people saying, no, wrong, you're an asshole. That's bad, that's dangerous, don't say that. Or sending it to people going, look at this idiot. And actually what that does is gives the mathematical amplification to disinformation. It takes advantage of an instinctive human aspect of our psychology, which is to correct false or dangerous information. And that false or dangerous information gets the algorithmic advantage. But there's an economic incentive in that. I mean, think about what most of our days are these days, arguing over what is a lie and what isn't. You know, our politics is like that these days. I mean, many of you will have watched the debate last night. I watched it with Lillian, who was curiously agitated when the orange guy was speaking. I think it's a good sign about her. But you know, we end up in these debates and we spend that time online doing that. So, okay, right now, why is that true? Well, it's because right now they have no cost for disinformation, and they have and actually it's a big boost to engagement and therefore advertising revenues. So how can we rebalance that? How can we introduce checks and balances on a currently imbalanced system? And that's really what CCDH is. CCDH is the answer to the question, how do we make it more costly to spread disinformation? And we do that in two ways. One is through regulation, which creates transparency and accountability, and where there's negligence and where it's human harm, you can hold them responsible through, the tort law. All of us know what tort law is. It's about being able to, restitution for harm. And the second way is by engaging advertisers. And we're very good at that. Our study when Elon Musk took over X showed that there'd been a tripling in the use of the N-word on that platform. And I think that's a very good example of how actually it's a lie to say that this is just a reflection of what people are saying, that the tone set by the owners of these platforms can change the way that behavior occurs on those platforms. A tripling in the use of the N-word in the week after he took over. That research that we did went on the front page of the New York Times, and it cost Elon Musk $100 million in advertising. And eventually led to his entire Trust and Safety Council resigning, and it's led to the exodus that's gone from there. I know that to be true because he then sued us for doing the research. I'm very happy to say we beat him in the lawsuit. Again, with the help of strategic long-term funders who understand that that's exactly what we were meant to be doing. We were meant to be in a position where a particularly capricious leader decided to sue us for exactly what we were meant to be doing. But it is about that systemic approach to it. And I mean, the way that I explain it in a very simple level is why checks and balances are needed. And of course, they're going to fight back against it. And we're in this big fight right now about freedom of speech and everything else. But it's all nonsense. It's not about freedom of speech. I mean, you don't make $100 billion like Mark Zuckerberg from free speech. This is monetized speech. Is because we have done something bonkers in reality. We've privatized the public discourse and the means of communication completely. And we've handed it over to 5 or 6 executives in Silicon Valley. And they have no checks and balances on them. And that's in part down to US law, something called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act 1996, which we're seeking to reform at CCDH. And we will work to do over the next 5 years. That when you have these loci of unaccountable power with no checks and balances within a liberal democracy is by definition being a place where no locus of power has 0 checks and balances on it. It's an entire system predicated on the idea that no one individual should be in charge and that there should be institutional complexity to manage the vicissitudes of one individual and their whims. That when you have a system with no checks and balances, it has an advantage, but it can also create enormous amounts of harm and potential, malignant behavior. And that's what we're doing. We're instituting checks and balances to bring back social media and the privatization of our public discourse into the democratic family of institutions that has checks and balances, that we venerate and value the positives that they bring. And when they create negatives, we tell them, like a good friend should, dude, you're being an asshole, stop it.
Thank you, Imran. I think your comments and the work that you do really illustrates work that's very compelling, also very edgy, also containing perhaps some risk. And so I think it's related to some of the questions that are starting to come up in the Slido. Before I ask you a second question, I just want to mention to people, if you don't have your own question, you can also give a thumbs up in the Slido to someone else's question, and so that will bring it higher on the list. So when we get to the Q&A part, I might focus on those that are the most popular questions. But Imran, my second question for you is, when we had a first call some months ago, you mentioned that you particularly appreciated the Skoll Foundation. And I'd just like to know, not to pander, but I know that was a genuine comment, and I'd like to know why. What is it about Skoll Foundation funding that you particularly appreciate? Thanks.
Look, information integrity has not been a focus of most funders. They see it as being ancillary to their primary focuses: climate change, sexual and reproductive rights, whatever migrants' rights, whatever else. When I first used to pitch CCDH, I used to pitch it as this is going to sound really bizarre given what I do for a living, but I started my career at Merrill Lynch. And this is a long time ago. I'm 46 tomorrow. So, this is pre 9/11. And I used to say that we were basically a derivative option that you buy with your main investment. So like you protect against catastrophic losses in your primary investment by basically hiring CCDH to make sure that if you care about climate, that you're not being fundamentally fatally undermined by disinformation. But, it's always frustrated me that we were not being seen as being important unto ourselves. It'd be the equivalent in the climate sector of people like saying, man, I think we should do something about that iceberg and that iceberg and that iceberg and that iceberg. And there's someone who's sitting in the background going, no, dude, it's climate change. There's something more fundamental. We've got to deal with systemic issues. So I've always been that guy screaming, no, it's climate change. But then willing to accept the money. I think what we got with Skoll was people that, first of all, as you heard, like Jess gave the systemic analysis as well as anyone I've ever heard deliver it, as pithily as, and I'm not pithy, as pithily as anyone can deliver it, that there is a fundamental system shift caused by economic incentives, which are misaligned with the public good. And with democracy, with science, with truth, with tolerance, with the ability to have societies which aren't Hobbesian fundamentally. And so, I think that they got that systems level analysis, but then they also, and this is where I usually lose my crowd. In my lifetime, and I worked in politics for 10 years in England, at a relatively senior level, the best piece of public policy I've ever seen is Donald Trump's Operation Warp Speed. So that was like, to me, the perfect example of Mazzucato's enabling government. Like, they spent the money on innovation, on manufacturing capacity, on everything simultaneously. And before I went to Merrill Lynch, I actually went to med school, and at med school I was taught we will never ever have a vaccine for coronaviruses because they mutate too fast, and that the economics don't support it. They did the impossible in a year, and that requires people taking bets and taking calculated bets, knowing they're going to lose money along the way, but realizing that the scale of the problem is so significant. So first of all, they built up a situation analysis which understood the value proposition, the danger that they had to deal with. But they also had a sense of urgency. And I think urgency drives innovation. It drives taking calculated risks, finding the right people, and then taking risks on them. And what I appreciate about Skoll is that they took a risk on CCDH. They did what many funders don't do, which is when they found a degree of success, they double down, and didn't say, well, we've done our job now, see you guys. They are just partners. I've learned recently the difference between, with my wife, being in a partnership and being in a team. Partnership is like, we love each other, we support each other, we're best friends. But like, looking after this, I suspect half hyena, half human who eats constantly, we've realized that we're a great team, that we actually just, and Skoll's always been a great team. They've been part of our team rather than just being partners. And I really appreciate about them. I feel like they are integral to the way that we operate. That's why I like Skoll. I can add some more money.
Okay, thank you. Jess, what do you think? Maybe instead of asking more about Skoll, I'm going to turn to one of the questions in the Slido, which is, will funders be ready to invest in long-term impacts? Because so much, both from what Renata talked about and what Imran talked about, these are changes that take 10 or 15 years or sometimes longer. There are often changes that rely so much on networks and coalition building, partnerships with NGOs and communities. When you see other funders working in a way that really supports that kind of work, what are you looking for partnerships with other funders? And how can we encourage more to go in that direction? Thanks.
Thanks. I think we're still learning about how systems change needs to be funded alongside anybody, but there's a few things that we have learned over our 25 years and, hope to influence other funders and bring them along. And that's certainly, one of our goals at the foundation is to catalyze more philanthropy into these big systemic issues that we think are incredibly interconnected with the other things that we care about. And so, multi-year general operating support is a huge piece of how we, whenever possible, try to operate with our partners, and really think that is critical to long-term system change. This isn't fixed in a year. We've seen CCDH do incredible work and be very influential on policy, on advertisers over the last year and a half, but this is a long game. And so really, committing to long-term partnership and flexible support that leads with trust with those partners, that these are the folks on the ground who know what is necessary to achieve change, is something that we'd like to see from more funders. We at Skoll, we're not experts in information integrity. I don't have a PhD in whatever discipline would be necessary in this specific to lead change here. It is, we need to find the people who are really leading this work at the front lines, whether it's climate folks who are in the Amazon basin or folks like Imran out of DC, and then learn from them. And so, our thinking has always been to start making grants early, to learn with our partners, to join funder collaboratives where we can learn from other funders who may have been in the space longer or who work in an adjacent kind of field and really figure out what sort of collective action across funders and doers is necessary.
Thank you. Latanya, I'd like to, if you don't mind, I want to ask you one of the questions that came up in the chat. Because you've had such a diverse background working in governments as well as and multilateral organizations, as well as in the philanthropy sector, one of the questions here is how to navigate political and relational issues when it comes to funding systems change work. And then Renata, questions have come up as well about supporting work at the community level, community-led systems change. So can I ask both of you in that order just to say a bit about that?
Yeah, and I'd love to, pivot off of just the way Jess was talking. It's the same in government and in almost any sector. It is absolutely required to do this work together. Often the systems that we're talking about changing are those systems in government. And I think sometimes the especially working from the social change side, the thinking is that there is, huge resistance to systems change in government. And I think it's like anything else. When you find the right partners, when you find advocates, allies in the system, oftentimes they are very much working together with you and trying to push things from the inside to make things work. So I would say, sort of maybe lose some of the often reality-based, assumptions that we have around working with government and multilaterals, and think more about who are the allies within those systems that can help us move the agendas. They are there. We know them, so my hope is that we'll meet them at some of these things like COP, we'll meet them at the UNGAs, and we'll continue to have and build a relationship with them and give them the necessary tools they need to be able to work from the inside to change the systems that already exist, and to introduce them to some of the partners. It's often funders in the philanthropic sector that are introducing government and multilaterals to partners like the ones that we're talking to today, to help them understand and see what the agenda is and what are some of the actual roadmaps that have already been set up by communities to move forward. So I'll stop there, but I hope that that's helpful.
And just a few comments on the Q&As. First, on your question, Heather, I think it seems obvious, but I think one lesson is like when arriving in a country, make sure that you know and get to know and do an effort to know the local philanthropists and the regrantee organizations that are already there, doing a lot on connecting with the grassroots movements that are already doing a lot of work. So it's like not reinventing the wheel, but making sure you promote initially this connection before you put funding on the ground. Because we have, like in Brazil, for example, we have like many Brazilian philanthropists talking about climate and doing a lot for at least 15 years. Second thing that I want to comment is like there was a comment on the chat on strategies to bring opposition. And I think a very good example now in Brazil, it is after the rains in Rio Grande do Sul and the severe drought and the fires that is taking the whole country. It is a very good moment to engage the agribusiness. And the GDP of the agribusiness in Brazil has already fallen 2.9% in this semester because of climate change and severe droughts. So we're really changing the narrative and focusing on this engagement with the agribusiness, especially the right wing of the National Congress, with the economic narrative. And this is working right now. And we are seeing that we have much more in common than we thought. The climate philanthropies and civil society and the agribusiness together through a coalition that we put in place and that is doing a lot of work in advocacy in the National Congress right now. So I think like trying to navigate on also what's happening and making that concrete and linked to the economic perspective, that is working really well in Brazil right now. And just a third comment, because you mentioned the Amazon and multi-year or general support. I think it's really important to emphasize that the time of the Amazon and of the countries that have tropical forests, it's really different. So that's why we need patient capital. So when we are talking about the time of the Amazon and multi-year general or multi-year grant, it's not like a 1 or 2, you know, we need 5 years and 10 years to start seeing the impact on new business models, for example, on the bioeconomy that is now that everyone is saying now. So it's really making sure that the philanthropy has a medium to long-term commitment, and that medium to long-term commitment may vary according to the country and the circumstances of each country.
Thank you, Renata. That was very helpful. Imran, I wonder if I can turn to you now. There's a couple of questions. One is about how do we support cutting through the noise and disinformation? There, as you mentioned, there is so much of it. So any strategies you can think of for that? And again, thinking about what funders can do, what might be a role of philanthropy there? And then also the question about, is this rise in what you talked about connected to changes in journalism, particularly at the local level? So the disappearance or decline of local newspapers and local journalism. Questions often come up about who do you trust in terms of who you get your news from. We convened a meeting with funders at the Shorenstein Center for Media and Public Policy at Harvard earlier this year. And a point was made about, if you look at ages of different people who they trust, older people might trust the New York Times. Younger people trust influencers who they feel they have a personal relationship to. Now, I don't know what that has to do with disinformation, but it's all about narratives and who we're influenced by. So if you could talk a little more about that, please.
Yeah, I mean, look, let me deal with the newsroom thing first. And I mean, part of the reason of the decline of the local news is because local news is a business and it relies on advertising. And what's been sucking up all the local business advertising revenues? Facebook for 20 years. Because it's amazing. I mean, like, it's a really high bang for buck, highly targeted way for local business to get to its local community. And it's just sucked all the money out of it. And of course, you've also got the problem of the local news. People share the articles on the local news. The way that platforms work is they try and keep the generation of the web page within their environments. They can control the advertising that appears on it. So you're not actually going onto their website to read it there, which is where they get a transactional fee for the delivery of programmatic advertising onto their website, is actually going to Facebook. And that's why Australia and Canada tried to pass laws which said that there had to be revenue sharing between platforms and news providers to try and protect their local news industries. And that, you know, Meta then fought back by basically saying, we will switch off all news in your countries. Like, you will no longer have the ability to post links to news articles in your countries. Sorry, I don't know why my Apple's doing that. But you know, so there is. I'm not trying to be cute or anything. It's connected, and you have to deal with the economic model first. The exploitative economic model. The entire model for social media companies, by the way, is really simple. Someone else produces the content. They just have an algorithm that reorders it to make it addictive to you individually, based on your proclivities and your indications by your user behavior in the past. So it's a fundamentally parasitic model on other people's content. And that's why local newsrooms have suffered so badly. Not just local newsrooms, but also you typing in, you know, the content that you type in every day. You're basically part of the business model. You are the product. And they just reorder it. I mean, that's the first point. I think the second point on, you know, how we cut through I mean, I'm not sure where that question is aimed at. Is it aimed at the individual? So let's take the individual who's trying to consume news. The problem that we have is that it's almost impossible to fact check everything all the time. There is a degree of arrogance that comes with educated liberals like us about that. You know, we went to good colleges. I learned facts. I have many facts. I have them bound in leather books in a library over there, which makes me feel good about myself. And I think that facts can fix every problem that I have, but they can't. And I think that we have this belief that everyone, if only people had access to good information, we could cut through the online disinformation. That's not true. There's a trick that there's a game I play when I'm giving speeches quite often. I ask people in the room, what vegetable gives you better night vision? And everyone always says, carrots. And I remind them that that was World War II disinformation produced by the British Secret Intelligence Service to hide the fact that we developed plane-mounted radar. And so we put it in the newspapers. We're feeding our boys carrots, which is how they can shoot down the Germans at night. It wasn't. We had radar. We developed plane-mounted radar. And now, still, 80 years later, everyone thinks that carrots give you better night vision. It's amazing the extent to which these myths and lies can be promulgated to smart people, and we're all smart people, right? Because we all went to colleges, so that makes us smart. But there is that I think it's really difficult. What we have to do is, this is a bit like COVID. You can't fix it. You've got to reduce R0. You've got to reduce the transmission rate. Because when people are having the same lies promulgated to them day after day after day algorithmically, it's registering in the back of their brain. They may not even be actively processing it, but in the lizard brain, they're seeing it every day. There's something called the illusory truth effect in our psychology. If we see something frequently, we think it's more likely to be true. It's part of the basic pattern recognition that's in the, that's how our brains work. And it's hacking us. It's hacking our brains into believing more disinformation. Many of the people that you will see who were rioting on January the 6th, or in London in England a few weeks ago after the disinformation-fueled riots in the UK, where someone lied and said 3 young girls were stabbed to death by a Muslim asylum seeker. They will have been lied to again and again. It's a drip of disinformation over long periods of time. So I think it's really hard to deal with that. The second thing is, at an institutional level, we are all having to deal with disinformation every day. The first report we ever wrote was called Don't Feed the Trolls, that talks about the mathematics of amplification and disinformation. So this is a 5-year-old report, the thing that launched us in September 2019. It's still worth reading. It's got a lot of the mathematics of how these platforms work. It's on our website. It's all free. Don't Feed the Trolls, counterhate.com. That's a way in which people can build resilience and understanding of the mathematics of these platforms so they can deal with disinformation on a live level. And we also do resilience training as well. So I've done resilience training for vaccinologists during the pandemic, for climate activists, for people who are in high, for anti-Semitism and anti-Islamophobia campaigners in the last few months, sadly, because of what's been happening in Israel and Gaza. So, there's been a lot of, we've helped people to up their understanding of how to be safe in those online spaces when you're an active combatant in the information ecosystem. And we are also, but I think at a more systemic level as well, how we can cut through the disinformation. Like, we've got to see it as a value. This is not a moral necessarily issue. This is a systems issue, and I think it requires collective action. My development director is going to lose her mind if I do not mention that on September the 22nd we're doing we're doing an event at UNGA this year. It's our first time at UNGA on disinformation, with the president of Skoll Foundation and with Melissa Fleming, the Under Secretary General for Communications at the UN. And please get in touch with Irina at counterhate.com if you're interested in that or finding out more about what we do. Thanks.
Thanks, Imran. An advert now and again is all right on our webinars. We don't have much time yet. I'm going to ask for a very brief answer from Jess and then Renata about a question that came in from one of our participants. What can smaller funders do with $10,000 to $20,000 in terms of the issues you're talking about? For many of us, that's not small, but of course, for some of the large institutional philanthropy, that's a small grant. But Jess, what would you suggest? Is there a collaborative that you would recommend or anything in particular?
I mean, it's a good question. A lot of, I will say, in the information integrity space, a lot of the doers and innovators are actually quite small themselves. This is an emergent space, and so even $20,000 can make a difference. And would be happy to talk to anybody about our portfolio. The other thing, Skoll believes very strongly in investing, but also connecting and championing. And so thinking about how far $20,000 can go in terms of bringing people together and helping create some connective tissue across different folks in the network in terms of supporting a convening, or something along those lines can really be catalytic beyond potentially the funding itself.
Thank you.
And
And Renata?
I think we ran out of time, Heather, but I would emphasize that it's not necessarily the size of the budget. When we compare Brazilian philanthropies to international philanthropies, it's quite different. But it's the power to convene, the power to articulate, the credibility that we have on the ground to be able to indicate like the best projects for the international funders to fund. And then this $10,000 can make a lot of difference. So it's like choosing 2 to 3 networks or projects that you could be engaged and help those projects to foster additional funding. So I think that would be super helpful.
Thank you. Great ideas. I want to thank everyone for joining, and especially to thank our 4 speakers. I hope this has been helpful, and please do stay in touch, connect with any of us, and we look forward to seeing you again on another webinar or in person. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.